Every incident in the picture, I was told, was taken from a true story or a true incident. They didn't all happen to the same person, and they involved different forces, whether it was the Army or the Marines.
For years, fans whispered about the chaos behind the scenes of Apocalypse Now. But now, Martin Sheen is finally telling the truth. What really happened in that infamous hotel scene? What nearly slayed him on set? And how close did the production come to collapsing completely?
I had never seen it. Even though I had done the narration for it, I had never seen the actual footage that it would be part, so I didn't know what you'd used. And it was so shocking.
This isn't just a movie story, it's a war story. A story of obsession, breakdowns, near-death moments, and real blood spilled for cinema. Today, we reveal what Martin Sheen has finally confirmed: the haunting truth behind one of the most dangerous and legendary film shoots in Hollywood history. The breakdown scene was real. Long before the cameras rolled on that infamous hotel room scene in Apocalypse Now, Martin Sheen was already spiraling. He had arrived on set, carrying the weight of years of addiction, self-doubt, and inner demons he couldn't shake. But no one, not even Sheen himself, knew just how much would surface when the lights came on. The scene, which would become one of the most iconic and disturbing in the film, wasn't in the script the way it played out. What happened that night wasn't acting. It was a man at his breaking point, exposing his real pain to the world. In the scene, Sheen's character, Captain Benjamin Willard, is alone in a Saigon hotel room, drunk and unhinged, spiraling into madness. The room is dark, cluttered, suffocating. At one point, Willard begins shadowboxing, stumbling, then completely breaks down. He punches a mirror, cutting his hand open and smearing blood across his face. His body writhes and shakes as he collapses onto the bed, crying, laughing, and gasping like a man possessed. Watching it today, the moment is haunting, unforgettable. But most of all, it's real. What audiences didn't know was that Sheen had shown up to set that night already drunk. This wasn't method acting, it was self-destruction. The emotional collapse wasn't scripted. The rage wasn't rehearsed. When he punched the mirror, it wasn't a stunt. It was glass. His hand really bled. And as his body twisted on the floor, Francis Ford Coppola watched from behind the camera in growing alarm. The director tried to stop the scene, fearing Sheen had gone too far and needed help. But Sheen refused. He begged Coppola to keep filming. This wasn't just about a movie anymore, it was personal. I bled quite a lot, and Francis tried to stop the scene, and I begged him to continue rolling, Sheen later revealed in a Raw interview. Please, he told Coppola, I must do this for myself. Against his instincts, Coppola relented. 2 cameras kept running as Sheen poured out years of bottled pain and fury. Sheen would later describe it as an exorcism, one he'd been building toward for years. I had to wrestle with some demons that I had been wrestling with for quite a while, he said. Now, I was doing it in a public forum, and in a sense, I got them out. This wasn't the first time Sheen had erupted like that. As he later admitted, he had done versions of that scene in real life, at home, in bars, and in private moments when the alcohol took over. He'd lived through breakdowns that never made it to screen. This time, though, it was different. This time, the entire world would watch. I had done that scene at bars. I had done that scene at home, Sheen told Bob Costas. I had to come to grips with it. I had to exorcise that out of myself. The emotional rawness captured on film was so unsettling that Sheen himself couldn't watch it for years. When he eventually saw the final cut, He said the man on the screen didn't feel like him at all. "Pretty frightening," he confessed. "Today, I don't recognize that man. Pretty sad guy. Trying to be something he wasn't, afraid of things that he shouldn't have been. Very painful guy." But it's that painful authenticity that turned the scene into legend. It marked the emotional heart of the film, violent, raw, and unfiltered. And it marked the beginning of something else too. The unraveling of Martin Sheen on the set of Apocalypse Now. That moment, captured forever on film, wasn't the darkest hour he would endure, but it was the first crack in the dam. And that was just the beginning of what nearly destroyed him on that set. The heart attack that nearly got him. It wasn't a metaphor when Martin Sheen said Apocalypse Now nearly got him. In March 1977, deep in the oppressive jungles of the Philippines, the 36-year-old actor suffered a massive heart attack that left him clinging to life. One moment he was preparing for another day of filming. The next, he was collapsed in the mud, his heart failing, miles from proper medical care. For Sheen, the chaos of the set had become more than psychological. It had turned physical, and it was closing in fast. The warning signs had been building for weeks. The filming schedule was brutal. The conditions, nearly inhuman. The air was thick with humidity, the bugs relentless, and every shoot was a test of endurance. Sheen's mental and emotional state was already frayed. He'd just filmed the now infamous hotel room breakdown, a scene that had left him bruised, bleeding, and emotionally gutted. But this wasn't about acting anymore. His body had reached its breaking point. One night, while alone in his hut, Sheen collapsed. The pain shot through his chest, down his arm, and into his back. A crushing weight that wouldn't let go. He was having a heart attack, alone in the jungle, with no doctor nearby and no hospital within reach. Sheen later recalled the fear that gripped him in those moments, not fear of death, but fear of dying so far from the people he loved. "I thought I was going to die without ever seeing my children again," he later said, his voice breaking with emotion. With no choice, the crew quickly scrambled to save him. He was placed on a stretcher and carried by Filipino locals and production staff several miles through rough terrain to reach a road. From there, he was rushed to a hospital in Manila. The diagnosis confirmed what they already suspected. He had suffered a serious myocardial infarction. Emergency surgery and intensive care kept him alive. The fact that he survived at all was considered a miracle. But the drama didn't end there. Francis Ford Coppola, already drowning in production problems, made a fateful decision. Keep it quiet. If word got out that the lead actor had nearly died on set, it could derail the entire film. Coppola feared the financiers would pull out. He feared the press would seize on the story and turn the movie into a scandal. Most of all, he feared the project, his life's work, would be destroyed. So the production crafted a cover story. They told the press Sheen was suffering from heat exhaustion. In reality, he was lying in a hospital bed with tubes in his chest and nurses at his side 24 hours a day. Meanwhile, his brother Joe Estevez quietly stepped in to film body doubles and voiceovers to keep the production moving. Joe would later say that even he didn't fully grasp how close Martin had come to death until he saw the worry etched in the faces of the crew. For Sheen, recovery wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. He described the heart attack as a moment of awakening, a kind of divine intervention that forced him to face his mortality. "I had to come to grips with my life," he later said. "I'd been running, and it finally caught up to me." The event marked a turning point, not just in his career, but in his personal life. From that moment on, he began to change slowly, painfully, but deliberately. And yet, in classic Apocalypse Now fashion, even his near death wasn't enough to stop the madness. Within weeks, Sheen returned to the set, frail, shaken, and still recovering. He had to finish what he started. He had to see it through. But even when death came knocking, Sheen wasn't the only one unraveling. Coppola's madness took over. By the time Martin Sheen was being carried out of the jungle with a failing heart, another storm had already been brewing behind the camera. Francis Ford Coppola, director, producer, visionary, was unraveling. What began as a bold artistic gamble had spiraled into a waking nightmare. And unlike the fictional chaos unfolding in front of the lens, Coppola's breakdown was real. Deep in the Philippine jungle, the director of The Godfather was battling his own personal war. A war against the clock, against money, against failure, and ultimately, against himself. Coppola had done the unthinkable. He bet everything he owned on Apocalypse Now. When the studio grew uneasy about the ballooning budget and endless delays, he didn't back down, he bought them out. He mortgaged his home, his vineyard, and his future to personally finance the film. The deeper the production sank into chaos, the more personal the stakes became. He wasn't just trying to finish a movie, he was fighting to keep his life from falling apart. If Apocalypse Now collapsed, so would everything he'd built. And slowly, the pressure began to crush him. Coppola's wife, Eleanor, had come along to document the making of the film, but what she captured on tape wasn't the story anyone expected. Her camera, quiet, observant, caught the director pacing in despair, staring into nothing, hands shaking as he muttered about failure. The man who once commanded Hollywood's respect was now wandering through the jungle, haunted by indecision, trapped inside a movie with no clear end. "My greatest fear," he confessed on tape, "is to be thought of as a failure." The breaking point came when Coppola realized he couldn't write the ending. After all the months of shooting, all the money spent, all the suffering endured, he still didn't know how the film would conclude. Draft after draft failed. He cried openly. He raged at his own words. He tore pages out of his notebook and cursed into the humid air. He once described the movie as a $30 million improvisation. That wasn't hyperbole. It was reality. The crew watched in disbelief as each day's work was rewritten on the fly, entire sequences constructed from desperation. He later admitted the obvious. We had access to too much money, too much equipment, and little by little, we went insane. That wasn't just a poetic flourish, it was the truth. The production no longer felt like a Hollywood film set. It felt like a battleground. Exhaustion, confusion, paranoia, they all crept in like ghosts. The jungle swallowed time. Deadlines became meaningless. Sanity was a fading concept. And still, Coppola kept going. Why didn't he walk away? Why didn't he shut it down before it consumed him? The answer, perhaps, lies in the very story he was trying to tell. Apocalypse Now was never just a war film. It was a descent into the heart of darkness. And Coppola, knowingly or not, was living it in real time. The director became a reflection of his own characters. Obsessed, broken, unable to escape the madness around him. Yet even as his grip loosened, something extraordinary happened. His actors, his crew, they stayed. They trusted him. Even when he was unsure, they followed. Why? Because Coppola gave them space to create. He let them improvise, explore, and take risks. Actors would walk through fire for Francis, one cast member recalled, because he let them make it their own. Then he shaped it into what he wanted. And yet, one troubled genius was still to arrive, with his own chaos in tow. Brando was unrecognizable. By the time Marlon Brando finally arrived on set, Apocalypse Now was already buckling under the weight of its own ambition. Martin Sheen had suffered a heart attack. Coppola was drowning in rewrites and self-doubt. But there was still hope that Brando, Hollywood's greatest living actor, could help save the film's final act. Instead, his arrival would ignite yet another crisis, one that forced the production to bend, reshape, and ultimately surrender to chaos once again. Brando was supposed to play Colonel Kurtz, the film's mythical and terrifying final figure, a man consumed by war, madness, and power. Coppola had envisioned a gaunt, haunted figure. But what he got was something very different. When Brando stepped off the plane in the Philippines, he was shockingly overweight, nearly 300 pounds, and completely unprepared. He hadn't read Heart of Darkness, the novella on which the film was based. He barely understood who Kurtz was supposed to be. In fact, he didn't even know most of his lines. The man who had once transformed himself for every role now seemed unwilling to do the work. Coppola was stunned. This wasn't the lean, intellectual presence he had imagined to confront Willard at the end of the river. This was a different man, larger, slower, and increasingly unpredictable. Panic set in. Brando had been paid $3.5 million up front, and the studio was already over budget. Coppola couldn't afford to fire him. So instead, he improvised again. He rewrote the ending. He hid Brando's body in shadows. Scenes that were meant to be physical confrontations became whispered conversations in the dark. The climax of the film was no longer visual. It was cerebral. Coppola turned to shadows and camera tricks, wrapping Brando in darkness to hide his size. Kurtz became more ghost than man, half seen behind columns and lit only from behind. It wasn't what Coppola wanted. It wasn't what anyone planned. But strangely, it worked. The mystery grew. The ambiguity deepened. Brando's silhouette, paired with his rumbling voice, became part of the film's hypnotic power. Still, directing Brando proved nearly impossible. He refused to say certain lines. He challenged Coppola constantly. Most of what he ended up delivering were improvised monologues, cryptic, philosophical, sometimes brilliant, often baffling. He rambled about morality, darkness, and war. Sometimes he would spend hours debating a single sentence, trying to twist it into something meaningful. Other times, he would disappear entirely, vanishing from set until someone went to find him. Coppola had no choice but to find the performance in post-production. He pieced together Brando's dialogue like a puzzle, taking bits from multiple takes and overlaying them with moody music and haunting visuals. The scenes became surreal, floating somewhere between poetry and madness. It was improvisation at its most extreme, not just from the actor, but from the director, editor, and entire crew. In the end, the film's final act, once expected to be a traditional showdown, became something far stranger and more unnerving. Brando's presence was unsettling, not just because of the character he played, but because of the tension behind every scene. Viewers could feel that something was off, and that feeling was real. Behind the shadows, behind the whispered words, was a production in full collapse. Yet somehow, the film didn't break. It bent. It shifted. It evolved into something darker, more introspective. And perhaps that's what made Apocalypse Now endure. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It reflected the chaos that created it. But while the legends were falling apart, the jungle itself was becoming a brutal enemy. Nature fought back. It wasn't just the actors and filmmakers unraveling on the set of Apocalypse Now. As if mirroring the unraveling psyches of those behind the camera, the Philippine jungle itself turned against them. The elements, as relentless as any enemy in war, attacked day after day. Equipment failed. People got sick. And then, nature landed a devastating blow that nearly wiped the film out entirely. A typhoon, brutal and unforgiving, swept across the region midway through production. It hit with the kind of force you don't forget. Winds roared, trees snapped, and entire sets, painstakingly built to recreate the Vietnam War zone, were demolished overnight. Costumes were soaked. Props were lost. Scenes that had taken weeks to prepare were destroyed in hours. For a film already teetering on the edge of collapse, it was a nightmare come true. The crew had no choice but to halt everything. The production was effectively sent back to square one. Rebuilding took weeks. Every day that passed added millions to the already bloated budget. Coppola had once hoped to finish filming in 6 months. That schedule was now laughable. The jungle, it seemed, didn't care about deadlines or dreams. It was a beast unto itself, untamed, unpredictable, and absolutely unforgiving. But the storm was just the beginning. Day after day, the cast and crew endured conditions more punishing than any studio film had faced before. The heat was suffocating. The air felt heavy, thick with moisture, pressing down on everyone like a weight. The humidity drenched their clothes and warped their equipment. Insects swarmed relentlessly. Mosquitoes, beetles, and creatures few of them could name. Parasites thrived in the water and the soil. Some crew members contracted hookworm. Others simply gave up and left. Illness became routine. Filming in the jungle wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. Every morning brought the same question: would they even be able to shoot today? And most days, the answer depended on the skies. Torrential rainstorms slammed the production with biblical force. "It rained like it was mad at you," actor Damien Leake later said, describing the sheets of water that fell without warning. Entire locations would flood within minutes, turning roads into rivers and sets into swamps. Lighting equipment shorted out. Generators failed. Makeup washed away. Rehearsals were impossible. And still, the schedule pressed on. The crew tried to adapt, building temporary shelters, covering equipment with tarps, drying out film reels with hair dryers. But it often felt like fighting the tide with a broom. One day, they'd be filming under clear skies. The next, they'd be waist-deep in mud, staring up at thunderclouds. "Every day was a gamble," one crew member said. "You just hoped you'd survive it." And through all of it, Martin Sheen, still recovering from his heart attack, still haunted by his on-screen breakdown, pressed forward. His hands still bore the scars from the broken mirror. His body was still frail. But he kept showing up. Day after day, he stood knee-deep in mud, under pouring rain with cameras rolling. Some say he should have gone home. Some say he should have quit. But Sheen was determined to see it through, even if it broke him completely. There was something poetic, if not tragic, about the way man and nature clashed on that set. Coppola's vision was to portray war as madness, but the making of the movie had become its own descent into chaos. The jungle didn't just challenge them, It consumed them. And yet, even as the weather broke their spirits and bodies, something else was happening. A strange transformation. The lines between fiction and reality were disappearing. The movie wasn't just about war anymore, it was becoming one. And through it all, Martin Sheen was still bleeding, still broken, and still filming. A war movie that became war. By the time Apocalypse now reached the middle of its filming schedule, if such a thing could still be called a schedule, the production had stopped pretending it was a controlled artistic endeavor. It was no longer just a movie about war. It had become war. For the actors, the crew, and especially Martin Sheen, the jungle wasn't just a backdrop anymore. It was their battlefield. Martin Sheen would later describe the experience with chilling clarity. It felt like a real war. The line between performance and reality had blurred so much that even he couldn't tell where Captain Willard ended and where Martin Sheen began. The script, once rigidly followed, had become almost irrelevant. Scenes were rewritten on the fly. Pages were discarded daily. Improvisation wasn't a choice, it was survival. There was no predictability, no rhythm, just heat, hunger, fear, and the sense that no one knew what would happen next. Filming days turned into nights, and back again. The jungle, already wild, became almost mythical in its hostility. Production offices were makeshift. Equipment was constantly failing, and the mental strain pushed everyone toward the edge. The actors lived in near-complete isolation. For long stretches, there were no phones, no mail, no real contact with the outside world. Some tried to stay grounded, but most slowly slipped into a kind of psychological limbo. Homesickness spread like a virus. Tempers flared. Some drank to numb the stress. Others experimented with illegal substances. The longer they stayed in the jungle, the harder it became to remember life back home. One crew member described it as being on deployment. It wasn't just a figure of speech. The set was treated like a war zone, complete with ranks, orders, and daily survival logistics. The film crew became their own battalion. Lighting grips moved like infantrymen. Cameramen packed gear like soldiers. Everyone was on high alert, always waiting for the next emergency, whether it was a weather collapse, an actor vanishing, or Coppola rewriting the ending yet again. Chaz Gerritsen, a war photographer hired to shoot stills of the production, summed it up best. Vietnam was insane. Apocalypse now only slightly less so. He had spent time in actual war zones, and yet what he witnessed on that film set wasn't far off. Explosions shook the jungle floor. Helicopters hovered. Fireballs lit the sky. Actors trained with real military advisors. It wasn't pretend. It was real chaos, choreographed just enough to keep the cameras rolling. One crew member became so desperate to reconnect with life outside the madness that he began making weekend trips, each time driving over 3 hours through rough terrain to Manila. But not for rest, not for escape. He would rent a hotel room facing the airport runway and simply watch the planes take off for the United States. He didn't board them. He just watched, longing for home, for normalcy, for an end. Meanwhile, Martin Sheen was still climbing deeper into the darkness of his character. Already scarred, emotionally, physically, and psychologically, he kept filming, kept working. But he wasn't the same man who arrived on set months earlier. The jungle had changed him. The role had consumed him. His body bore the wounds. His heart, weakened by the attack, still beat. But something inside had shifted permanently. Years later, when the chaos had subsided and the film was hailed as a masterpiece, Sheen finally sat down to watch the finished product. He watched the story unfold. He saw the madness, the descent, the breakdowns, the blood. He watched himself unravel on screen, scene by scene. And when the credits rolled, Martin Sheen said just 6 quiet words. But what happened when Martin Sheen watched it all back years later? I don't recognize that man. Years after Apocalypse Now had premiered, after the awards, the acclaim, and the whispered legends surrounding its chaotic production, Martin Sheen finally sat down to watch the film with fresh eyes. The man on the screen, the bloodied, broken soul crawling through a hotel room, the haunted assassin drifting through the jungle, was supposed to be a character. But to Sheen, it was something far more intimate. It was a painful time capsule, a snapshot of someone he no longer knew. He watched himself punch a mirror in a drunken haze, watched himself smear real blood on his face. He saw the trembling hands, the wild eyes, the sadness that seemed to soak through every movement. And as the credits rolled, a chill went through him. It was frightening, he later admitted. Today, I don't recognize that man. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. The man on that screen had walked into that jungle carrying wounds invisible to the world. Years of alcoholism, self-doubt, fear, and unresolved grief. Playing Captain Willard had forced him to lay those demons bare. In doing so, Sheen hadn't just acted out madness, he had lived it. The process blurred his identity. Who was Willard? Who was Sheen? At some point, even he didn't know. He described that younger version of himself as painful, afraid, and trying to be someone he wasn't. And perhaps that's the tragedy embedded in Apocalypse Now. It wasn't just the story of a man going up the river to confront a monster. It was about confronting yourself, your shadows, your failures, your rage, and realizing the enemy might be living inside your own skin. The jungle didn't break Martin Sheen, but it did expose him. And in that exposure came something unexpected: healing. As destructive as the experience was, Sheen would come to view Apocalypse Now not as his downfall, but as a turning point. The raw, unfiltered emotion he poured into that role, born not from rehearsal, but from years of real pain, became a kind of release. A brutal confession, one that helped him step forward from the darkness of addiction and toward a future with clarity. I had to exorcise it out of myself, he had said years before. And now, looking back, it was clear he had. The blood wasn't just for effect. The breakdown wasn't just for show. That performance, as harrowing as it was, became a form of catharsis, a purging of everything he had buried inside for too long. He didn't regret it. He didn't glorify it either. Sheen was always honest about the toll it took, not just physically, but spiritually. But he remained proud of what he helped create. Because Apocalypse Now wasn't just a film, it was a reckoning. A moment in cinematic history where the curtain was pulled back and real, uncomfortable truth spilled out. And Martin Sheen was at the very center of it. It was a role that nearly slayed him, but it was also the role that forced him to live. That's why today, when we revisit Apocalypse Now, we're not just watching one of the most iconic war films ever made. We're witnessing a man fight for his soul, frame by frame, line by line, wound by wound. Martin Sheen didn't just survive that journey. He emerged from it changed, wiser, and, finally, at peace with the man he had been. And now, after decades of silence and mystery, we finally understand the truth behind what really happened on that infamous set. And maybe that's the paradox of Apocalypse Now. It destroyed so much to reveal something honest. For Martin Sheen, the chaos wasn't just worth it, it was necessary. Because sometimes the only way out of darkness is to walk straight through it. It pushed him to the edge, both physically and emotionally. But in that unraveling, he found something real. Not just a performance, but a reckoning. And for the first time, he stopped running from it. Martin Sheen's haunting journey through Apocalypse Now wasn't just a performance, it was a real-life exorcism of pain, addiction, and fear. If you thought the movie was intense, the true story behind it is even more powerful. Like, comment, and subscribe for more untold stories behind iconic movies. And don't miss our next video, revealing the shocking secrets behind another Hollywood classic.